Thank you very much for the introduction. My role today is to introduce some of the established methods for technical study of paintings and to provide examples of how the results can inform questions related to their construction, condition and physical history. I would point out at the beginning that some of these techniques are quite suitable not only for paintings that I'm going to focus on, but also for other sorts of painted surfaces, with a few exceptions, but most of the techniques are quite similar and can provide similar sorts of evidence. An introduction to the methods used for technical study of paintings is relatively straightforward because X-radiography, infrared imaging, detailed surface investigation using microscopy and analysis of paint have been applied to study paintings for many decades. And institutions that have access to the resources and expertise for technical study have used this data to inform a variety of historical questions. There are a number of publications that provide context for new research on 16th century paintings in England and Northern Europe that have considered technical evidence, and I've just put some of these up. These are just examples that are notable for me, really. Rika Jones's and Susan Foyster's contribution to the exhibition catalogue for the Dynasties exhibition in 1995, quite some time ago now. Lorne Campbell's 15th century Netherlandish schools catalogue, the National Gallery Technical Bulletins, which are now 31 years old, and the Making and Meaning exhibitions, particularly the Ambassadors, are exemplary collaborations between scientists, conservators and art historians and curators, which I think have taken the field quite a long way. There are a number of other case studies that have been published, for example, in Hamilton Carr technical publications, and international studies that I haven't put up, including Art Matters, the Netherlands Journal, the publications by ERPA from Brussels, and the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. Also recently, the publication of the contributions to the Caroline Villas Memorial Conference Trade in Artist Materials includes some papers that examine the commerce, the transport, trade in materials that influenced the production of art to 1700. Notable for the subject of this conference is Ian Tyer's article on the import of European oak boards to England and Joe Kirby's article on the trade in artist materials in 16th century London. And I think this is a really useful kind of publication which crosses boundaries. Evidence from a number of recent technical studies of Tudor and Jacobean paintings will be presented by my colleagues and experts at this conference. The interpretation of the results of the technical analysis of 16th century paintings in an historical context, which is a challenge, is a particularly challenging thing to do, and it's a central theme of this conference, and people will do it in different ways. But firstly, I wanted to qualify the application of technology to study art. And while materials are, the methods that we use are based on science, their application doesn't really satisfy the fundamental criteria for the experimental scientific interpretation of data from these sorts of scientific studies. First of all, the number of works is very small and maybe not representative of 16th century artistic output. Technical study itself is very selective and it's often not reproducible. There are many practical and ethical limitations on gathering similar data from all the works in a study, and thus the results are never statistically robust. These are all basic scientific principles which are never fulfilled by this sort of application. Having said that, it's still very useful, and I hope to show that, and I think my colleagues will also show that during the conference. The paintings from this period that survive vary quite significantly in quality and condition, and often there's little or nothing known about the date, the sitter, the provenance, or the specific function of the work. Few of the works for which there is documentary evidence and other historical references, for example, artists' treaties, documents related to the purchase of materials and artists' workshop practices, are thus in very important points of reference for the interpretation of the new technical evidence. This is a painting which I think is a typical example of work made in the middle of the 16th century where very little is known about the picture. And we've been investigating this using technical evidence at the Courtauld. It's a work in progress. And I thought it would provide an interesting vehicle for introducing the methods, the limitations, and the results. The historical questions that initially focused on identity and authorship evolved through the interpretation of the technical evidence to consider new questions of purpose and function. And where I can't make the points I want to make about different technical studies, I'm going to use some of the really stellar examples from the study at the National Portrait Gallery, which is of much more beautiful pictures and hopefully more beautiful examples. But this painting was bequeathed by Lord Lee of Fareham to the Courtauld Gallery in 1932, and there's little, almost no information about its provenance. It's dated 1550, but neither the sitter nor the painter is known. And scholars, quite rightly, have suggested that it's Netherlandish based on style, and that's led to its current attribution. The painting's painted on Baltic oak, and it luckily hasn't been thinned, so we can see the original back. And there's nothing really noteworthy about it from the back, which makes it distinctive apart from the seal, which we haven't identified precisely yet. The Society of Arms told me this morning they'd received the cheque, so they're going to be working on this soon. But John Goodall, who I've consulted about it, who knows a lot about heraldry, suggested that the seal on the back is continental from the 18th century, with either an earl or more probably a count's crown. This shows the backs of a selection of 16th century panels from the National Portrait Gallery, some made from English oak and others of oak imported from the Baltic region. It's not known whether there are dedicated panel makers in England in the 16th century, although it seems likely at this time there were workshops in Antwerp where these panels were produced that by the 17th century were actually branded by individual specialist painters with their individual panel marks. These panels, unlike others that have been thinned from the back as part of a former conservation treatment, show a variety of tool marks, quality of wood and workmanship in making the panel. The sizes are not standard, neither the whole panels nor the individual board widths, partly because some of the panels have been trimmed or cut down from their original size. This is extremely common. The structure and quality of some of these panels that were used for the painting of English sitters is closely similar to that used for the Netherlandish man that I've just shown you. This physical evidence supports what is known about the trade and supply of oak that was used for panel painting in both England and the Netherlands, but we cannot say with confidence where the panel was made. That is the Netherlandish man panel. Expert analysis by Ian Tyers, you can see here, of the patterns of growth rings present in cross-sections of timbers from which panel paintings are made provides information about the felling date of the tree from which the boards were cut. This technique has provided the earliest possible date for some paintings and has proved decisive in some issues of the dates of copies. Ian Tyers' knowledge of the wood trade has advanced our ability to identify marks on the backs of panels that relate to their origins as shipments of planks that were used for many purposes, for example, wainscoting and I think coffins, and I think he's probably got a few more examples of what they were for. And with accumulated knowledge, it may be possible to identify planks from the same forest or even individual tree in related panel paintings. And there was just an example this morning that Tanya gave you. And this has been done recently for a group of panels by Rubens by Ian Tyers. Firstly, X-radiography as a basic technique for looking at paintings. X-rays penetrate the entire thickness of a panel, and that's where the passages on the X-ray look dark. And where the image looks light, the X-ray has been absorbed by the painting materials. And here the contrast in most pictures, the contrast is largely determined by the presence of lead-white pigment in the paint that is highly absorbing of X-rays and the thickness of the panel. So where the panel's actually thicker or there's lead-white, you can see it looks light. Here the radiograph provides information about the oak boards that were butt joined originally using wooden dowels and then later the original buttons. I think you can see the wooden dowel holes here at intervals. Some of them empty, some of them filled, and these are the later wooden buttons added later in a conservation treatment. The flesh paint is thinly applied with sparing use of lead white pigment that registers just discernible in the face and hands of the sitter. I think you can see his face and hands here, and the ring which has been painted out. There's a wide series of sweeping strokes associated with the priming layer that also contains some lead white. These sweeping wide strokes that don't relate to anything. We cannot identify specific pigments used for the work, but we can see the small paint losses, which you probably can't see from here, where the paint is absent. There are little losses that you can see close up. And these are not visible through the opaque yellow varnish on the surface of the painting, and this sort of information is useful as an indication of the condition of the work in relation to future possible conservation treatments. So not only does it tell you about the original technique, but also about the condition, things you can't see from the surface. X-radiography can show more interesting features still, and the best examples, this one from the recent study of paintings at the National Portrait Gallery, indicate the reuse of support. And you can see here, Elizabeth portrait, 2 heads superimposed. So the portrait's been used again, completely different head in a different direction. And also you can see the feather that she's holding is something else like a snake. This will be talked about in more detail later. So sometimes X-radiographs can be quite dramatic and provide quite interesting information about the reuse of a panel. Detailed microscopy and micrography is a very useful technique, which has also been mentioned before, and it's a kind of connoisseurship, but can also help you to identify aspects of condition. Typically we use a microscope which magnifies the image about between 30 and 200 times, and we can take good detailed images which we can subsequently blow up in even more detail and look at surface condition. I think this was useful in this case for looking at the original inscription, 1550, we can see is in the original lead tin yellow paint, so we can be pretty sure that that's a genuine signature and not something added later, whilst the 34 and the Etatis has been strengthened using modern 19th century containing pigment. So this sort of close study of the surface can provide some basic information. I think notable for finding out about this particular picture was this coat of arms on the ring, which I know is a very precise science to identify with absolute certainty what the relationship between this ring is and the family. So I just show a page from one of the enormous encyclopedias of heraldry, and of course one has to consult experts, and this is the Tudor, which is the Tudor coat of arms, which is close but nothing like as precise as it needs to be to identify the sitter. However, John Goodall, my other contact before I get the final word from the Society of Arms, said interestingly that the quartering of identical shields here, rather than impaling the two, implied that either the sitter or his father married a considerable heiress. So that's as far as we've got with that one. Quite exciting, even if we don't know who it is. Light microscope examination and microscopy. For this picture, the HE monogram Lady Mary Neville and her son Gregory Fines, the Baron Dacre portrait in the National Portrait Gallery, has provided fantastic information about the technique. So I thought I'd show you through a few lovely details. The way that the underlayer or priming can be used as part of the surface final effect of painting jewellery, and the very fine strokes used to paint the fur, which can be useful to, as everyone's pointed out, to characterise a particular artist technique, the handling of paint, and the particular sorts of techniques used for painting, which create certain effects of illusion of these fantastic surfaces. Also, they can be used to compare with other HE monogram or other works in the same group to see how closely similar they are. And I put these examples in which show not only eyes from different HE monogram pictures and a rather Monty Python-like, I suppose, finger here, which are always quite useful to see, but also that some of the pictures are extremely damaged. This is for the Luttrell portrait, the detail of the eye at the Courtauld. This is entirely a reconstructed eye. It's not original. So it's obviously important when making these comparisons to identify the condition of the picture and to be clear what you're looking at is original, whether it's an addition or a later addition by a conservator or reworking. Libby Sheldon will be talking next about looking at paint, pigment and layer structures, how artists have applied materials and exactly what the materials are. And this has been an important part of the study that she's carried out. I just show an example of a cross-section here taken from the leaf, again from the Luttrell portrait, here from this spot. And you can see that the cross-section contains a green pigment which might have gone brown in places, so sometimes you get information about deterioration. There are possibilities for characterising specific or unusual materials and techniques used for painting, trends in the underlying preparatory layers. As you can see here, these underlying priming layers, and their colour and constitution, characteristic deterioration of pigments, identification of repaints from earlier restorations that might inform trends and interpretation of display, because of course these pictures have been restored many times and may have been restored differently depending on the cultural context and perceptions of those particular eras in which they were restored. And I think this is another area of some interest. Cross-sections from this Netherlandish man showed something quite characteristic and typical of groups of pictures of this period, middle of the 16th century, a chalk containing ground, a layer of underdrawing here, a priming layer. This is the layer that shows in these sweeping strokes on the X-ray because it contains lead white. And then the paint layer, which interestingly in cross-section shows the particles of blue pigment, azurite, which might suggest that the original background was blue rather than brown. This is in UV light. You can see the layers a little bit more clearly. You can see the layers of superficial varnish and restoration over the broken and abraded original paint here, and then the priming layers, the drawing layer, and the ground. So this is quite a typical layer structure for pictures of this period, but they do have different sorts of characteristics, and Libby will talk more about that. It's now possible and quite important to not only look at the pigments, but to look at the organic binding media and other sorts of materials that might have been added to paint that could create the special effects. Not only might oil paint be used, but oil paint that's been bodied or treated in different ways, which might provide it with greater body and bulk, which might explain some of the very fine characteristics we see on the painting surfaces, and the underlying layers and how they relate to one another. So these sorts of techniques are now being carried out in conjunction with the pigment analysis to examine the layer structure and to look in particular now at specific media used or binding media that could be different, used for different layers. This is just a detail taken from this, again, the Netherlandish portrait showing that protein was used as the binding medium, these hot spots at the bottom in red, to bind the chalk, and then that oil, lead carboxylates indicative of oil, are used in the paint film and in the priming. So it's now possible by analysis of small samples or even cross-sections to identify the organic materials and as well as the inorganic materials, which might explain some special effects and also deterioration. The importance of understanding the binding media is just brought home by this kind of rather sledgehammer-like example, comparing egg tempera and the quick drying egg tempera with very visible strokes to the detail and blending that you can get, the special effects that are done in oil paint. I think this just brings home the importance of the binding medium and understanding what it is into trying to interpret special effects in painting techniques. Infrared reflectography is quite possibly the most useful technique for looking at 16th century paintings, which are generally thinly painted, and where carbon black containing underdrawing, which is usually applied in a dry or a fluid medium, contrasts with the white, typically chalk preparation layer. Infrared radiation penetrates paint and is reflected back by the white ground, except where the carbon black is used for the drawing, that might be applied freehand or show more regular characteristic lines that are indicative of the use of tracings or transfer of designs from face patterns. And here are a fantastic two portraits of Elizabeth, which show the use of the same face pattern in reverse. You see here and in reverse here. These are just details of the same. And you can see that the painting doesn't follow precisely the face pattern in this case. The painted layer is set beside it. And I also included this surviving example of a face pattern, which is in the National Portrait Gallery, obviously not of Elizabeth, but of Bishop Fisher. It's actually painted up in oil, it's on paper, and there are prick marks around the edge which show that it was used for transfer of a face pattern from one support to another. This will be discussed in more detail later in the conference by my colleagues. Infrared reflectography of the Netherlandish man showed something a little bit unusual, and that is, I think you can see there's a detailed structure underneath in the drawing, underneath the portrait, which bears little relationship to the surface painting. I'm just going to show you some details incredibly under the face. You can see how absolutely shocked we were when we simply looked at a non-invasive technique using infrared at this painting. I'll show you under the hands, where it's very easy to see through light-coloured paint and rather more difficult to see through dark paint, so you don't get the whole picture using this technique we used. That Rachel Billinge was kind enough to look at this picture for us, of course. I think you can see underneath the hand there are figures praying. You see these two figures standing, and there are other figures here. I thought it might be worthwhile making a comparison between what we saw in the underdrawing, it was quite possible to do that, with these paintings or these works on paper by Dirk Jacob Vellet, who was working or alive between 1480 and maybe 1549. He was from Antwerp. He was a painter, engraver, designer of stained glass windows, and ran a big workshop. He was a registered member of the Guild of St. Luke in 1511 in Antwerp, and he was recorded as taking pupils for several years after that. He might have worked in England. He certainly designed the stained glass windows at King's College Chapel in Cambridge here, and this is a detail from the stained glass windows there. And this is a vidimus, a small, very small drawing that he made for one of the windows at King's College, which is from the Bowdoin Art College Museum in America. So I wanted to make the comparison between the underdrawing and the vidimus and other drawings in the British Museum, which are attributed to Vellet, just as a final piece. So a series of comparisons. I don't know, here we are, this is a detail from the Bowdoin Museum, another one showing quite similar characteristics. And this reclining figure, I thought. And I put this one in too, again from the British Museum, Vellet. This is a drawing which has many changes, so there are lots of alterations and changes to the composition on paper as well as underneath. This is, again, details from the vidimus and from other drawings compared with the architecture. So the evidence from technical study of the Netherlandish man with a skull gathered so far shaped new historical questions about workshop practices in the 16th century. And examples of these questions include, were the panels used for different purposes and reused, perhaps by other artists working together? And how did Netherlandish material practices influence English artists working here and in the Netherlands? So the ambiguity between whether this is really English or painted in English is very clear. Did English foreign painters, etchers, stained glass designers, and other artists and craftsmen collaborate, share studios and materials? The original questions of authorship and of the painted portrait and the identity of the sitter have not so far been clearly illuminated by the technical study. While comparisons of underdrawing visible in infrared images from Vellet's drawings might be compelling for me, you might reasonably argue that the comparison is made only because they survive, and they're available to me at relatively high resolution from the British Museum, from the Bowdoin website, and that facilitates the comparison. Indeed, there may be much closer comparisons from extant drawings by Antwerp artists that are unattributed, or perhaps there is nothing that survives that is comparable. The limitations of analytical methods and temporal advances in technology applied to study of art is another significant variable. It's possible that improved infrared imaging methods would reveal more information that could be critical, as has recently been highlighted in Caravaggio's scholarship. That formerly they didn't think that he did any underdrawing, but new technology for infrared imaging has revealed the drawing that we know he did, which changes everything. Indeed, the critical mass of evidence is important. It seems likely that the accumulation of data from a number of new technical studies of paintings from this era, there will be patterns that emerge. Interpretation of this evidence by collaboration between specialists with different expertise has proved successful in informing historical questions and forming new hypotheses, and I look forward very much to this synergy, which will emerge, I hope, in the next few days of this conference. Thank you.